Now, before we get into our program, I do want to acknowledge that we are coming together virtually on a place that Indigenous people for thousands of generations have called Turtle Island. We are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we are grateful for their stewardship of this land going back centuries. Now, today is March 1st, so not only are we kicking off the first day of NEM, we are also celebrating P.Eng Day in Ontario, which started in 2018 when OSPE called for formal recognition from Queen's Park that every March 1st be declared Professional Engineers Day. P.Eng Day recognizes the vital role that professional engineers play in building and safeguarding Ontario. So with all of that now having been said, let us now introduce our guests and we'll have a bit of a discussion for you. Cheryl Farrow is the CEO of the Ontario Association of Certified Engineering Technicians and Technologists. Sandro Perruzza is the CEO of the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. And Johnny Zuccon is the CEO and Registrar of Professional Engineers Ontario. I see you three on my Zoom screens here, which we're all spending way too much time doing these days, but at least it allows us to be together. And as I welcome all of you to our discussion tonight, let me just do a few more housekeeping points before we get into our conversation. We are going to have a bit of a discussion here to start things off, but we are also going to take questions from our viewing audience at a certain point. So we invite all of those of you who are with us now virtually to use the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Send your questions into the chat, and then Bajal Shukla will edit out all of the profane ones and send the nice ones to us. I'll then put those to the panelists in a little while. But in the meantime, you can get those questions of yours in starting now, and then we'll take them, several minutes into the game here. Okay, let's start with just a real nice general question for the three of you, which is, I don't want to assume that everybody watching this knows what all of your different organizations are responsible for and what their various missions are. So let's just start there. Cheryl, what do you guys do?
So OACETT, and I'm going to use the short form after you've given everybody the longer mouthful. We are created actually through legislation for right to title. So as a result, OACETT is a combination of the Registrar for our certification programs and the Professional Association for Engineering and Applied Science Technicians and Technologists. We have over 25,000 members across Ontario. 73% of that group does hold one of our certifications as either a technician or a technologist. And we are focused on the combination of serving the needs of our members, but also helping to promote the fact that certified engineering technicians and technologists help to keep Ontarians safe.
Great. Sandro, what does OSPE do?
Well, we are the member and professional association for professional engineers, engineering graduates, internationally educated engineers, and engineering students. So we call that the engineering community. So we are their voice. We represent their interests to the government, to the media, to society in general. And the things that we do is we advocate to governments. We provide policy position papers on various things from energy, infrastructure, technology, labor skills for the future. And we also offer career services, professional development, and we find ways to save engineers money.
And Johnny, how about PEO?
Well, PEO is the self-regulatory body for professional engineering in Ontario. We've been granted the authority under the Professional Engineers Act to regulate both the practice of professional engineering and to govern our license holders and certificate holders, which are our entities that are offering engineering services to the public. And we do that in order that the public interest is served and protected. Just to give you a bit of history, PEO was established, believe it or not, in June of 1922. And we're looking forward to celebrating our 100th anniversary next year. hopefully face-to-face. And for anyone who's interested in more information about PO, I just direct you to our website at po.on.ca. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, now with all of that in place, just maybe by a show of hands here among the three of you, which of the three organizations is clearly the most important and prestigious of all? Okay,
Exactly.
Sandro, I was wondering when you were going to put your hand up. The other two beat you to it. Come on, man, let's go.
Save the best for last.
Oh, okay, that's good. All right. Well, let's get into our more formal conversation now, which, and I'll throw this out here for some discussion off the top. Should professional development be mandatory? Be mandatory for engineering and technology professionals? Cheryl, start us off.
Okay, well, I can certainly base this on OACETT's experience, because we actually made continuous professional development compulsory against our certifications, as well as the individuals who are pursuing certification, starting in 2016. And there were a couple of reasons that we looked at that. I think the first is that competence is a big part of the credibility that goes behind your certifications, and ensuring that individuals are keeping up to date on what's happening in their field is a big part of being able to demonstrate that competence. And I think the other side of things is just the pace of change. And you really can't expect to perform as a professional in our fields if you're not keeping current, because the fields are just changing so rapidly. So again, in order to defend the credibility of the certifications, we established a compulsory certification 5 years ago.
Sandro, how about you? Mandatory. What do you think?
Absolutely, without a doubt. Cheryl and I'll let Johnny also speak to, the safety side of things, the public interest and ensuring the public interest is protected, as well as the technical competency. Those are vital. But there's another aspect to this that is often overlooked and not discussed, and that's really looking at, and I don't want to call them the soft skills, so I'm going to talk about the interpersonal skills. The importance of being able to communicate to not only your colleagues, but also to society in general. One of the true gifts of engineering is not just the technical side, but it's the ability to design for society, for designing for a select group. Whether it's your clients or you're designing a transportation system for the masses, you have to understand how that technology is going to be applied. And part of that is actually going out and talking to the market, understanding the market. So being able to communicate, being able to understand, to share, knowledge and perspectives. So that's really important. Another aspect is financial literacy. If you're going to, design something, you also have to understand how much that's going to cost, not just a short-term cost, but the long-term cost. So how to create a budget, balance a budget, build business cases, and dare I say, how to sell an idea or concept to the masses or to your group or to your supervisor or to a client. So interpersonal skills are extremely vital. And I think any professional development program needs to look not only at the technical, but those interpersonal skills as well.
All right, Johnny, have you got a view on this?
Well, sure, of course. I think it's important for all professionals to subscribe to some form of professional development. It's part of the ethos of lifelong learning. And I think it's even more critical for engineers, as you heard, and engineering technology professionals. We're very likely immersed in, and in some cases, I think they're leading developing of new technologies that the public rely on. And I think there's a built-in expectation from the public that professionals subscribe to mandatory professional development, and more importantly, that their regulatory bodies impose it. I often cite my own relationship with my own doctors. I have no way of knowing how competent they are, but I do have some comfort when I know that they're members in good standing with their College of Physicians and Surgeons, which is the analogous body to Professional Engineers Ontario. So my only statement is that, PO has been a little tardy with getting on board with mandatory CPD. But as of last Friday, I'm pretty happy to report that our governing council passed a motion really that paves the way forward on this. But the public, I think, has been served well because I want to point out that under our act, of course, license holders are legally and ethically required to undertake work that they're competent to perform by virtue of their training and experience. So what this really translates to, it means that basically it's no longer sufficient to rely on the skills and knowledge that got you into the profession in the first place. There's an obligation, an actual requirement to upgrade your knowledge and skills along the way.
Well, let me follow up on the skills and knowledge that people get when they first enter the profession. And that is, I presume everybody at some point comes out with a post-secondary degree or certificate or something, which gets them into this field. And I guess, I mean, how many of us could not have possibly noted over the past year that trying to get that done virtually in a set of circumstances where you may not be able to have the kind of hands-on training that people in the past have had before this pandemic hit, that's a whole new kettle of fish. So I'm wondering whether or not, and again, Cheryl, why don't we start off with you here? Are you noticing gaps in the post-secondary engineering or technology programs, certainly during the pandemic, but maybe even before, that you think need to be addressed?
Well, I'm going to speak to this largely from the college community, because it's basically through the colleges that is the path into our certifications for the most part at OACETT. And our observation has been from the technical perspective, colleges deliver that extremely well and do a good job of staying on top of the emerging technologies, et cetera. But I think Sandro pointed out in his answer to the first question, this whole concept of soft skills. And many of those really came to the forefront during the pandemic. So things like the interpersonal skills, the ability to communicate if you can't be in person with the people you're trying to get your message across to, resourcefulness, creativity, resilience. And we acknowledge those are tough things to teach. They almost have to be integrated by osmosis into the curriculum, or find ways of adding them on. And I think the only other areas that that we would highlight would be gaps that we have looked to try to fill ourselves with the professional practice exam that is the next step after college and leading into the certification program. And that tends to focus in three areas: in law, in ethics, and in professionalism. Now, we do have some of our college partners who actually integrate that exam right into their curriculum and bring folks along. But those for us are the next steps of helping to prepare professionals to be effective in the workplace.
Sandro, how about you on this one?
First, I'm going to try to avoid the landmines, and I'll probably wind up stepping on every one of them. So first off, I'm going to say that the universities do a very good job of training young potential engineers and engineering graduates. They come out with a tremendous level of skill, but the universities can't be expected to fully develop an engineer. When you look at engineering and technology graduates, the industries they go into are so varied. For everything from mining and infrastructure, IT, municipal sector, energy sector, environmental sector, and then all the non-traditional industries like financial investment sectors, the pension funds hire engineers. So in reality, there isn't an engineering sector that engineering graduates and technology graduates go into and work. They're working in all these different sectors. So how is a school supposed to prepare every engineer for every job that's out there? So I'm going to put that caveat out there. And we host employment events, where we have anywhere from 12 to 16 to 18 employers, 200, engineers and engineering graduates, and we do some with OACETT as well. So we have the technology graduates as well, and technicians and technologists there. And you would think with that many, that much talent in a room, every one of those employers would fill up, their needs. And at the end, we say, we just can't find the right person, and they're missing something. It's always missing this or missing that. And sure, employers have an obligation to fill those gaps. But I can tell you, because I sit on the Engineering Deans Ontario Council, and they have been clamoring for years now that they need more flexibility to design the engineering programs to meet the needs of employers today. In Ontario and in Canada, actually, the engineering programs need to be accredited, but the accreditation model is outdated, and it's becoming more relevant every year. So the engineering deans and the engineering schools have been asking for some more flexibility. I know Engineers Canada, that manages the accreditation model, is looking at that. So until that gets fixed, and until there's some flexibility in there, and I don't know how the regulators deal with that, we need certainly to fill in some of those gaps. And there's one other area that hasn't been discussed that I think is vitally important, and that is the field of occupational health and safety. If engineers and engineering technicians and technologists are supposed to look after the public interest and public safety, a big component of that is actually occupational health and safety education, because that part really tells people how to evaluate risk, manage risk, and you need to be able to evaluate risk and manage risk at the design phase. And if engineers and technicians and technologists are designers at principal, that needs to be taught and I guess addressed while they're in school, not after they've graduated.
Johnny, that's 2 yeses we've heard so far on whether there are gaps in the post-secondary system. What are you going to say on this?
And actually, Steve, before Johnny jumps in, I just want to build on one point that Sandro had, and that was with respect to, how do you build the full engineer and the technician and technologist? And that also speaks to, I think, a strong component, and it's in many levels of post-secondary, which is the experiential side of things, and where programs are building in the internships and the co-op opportunities and those sorts of things. That, in a lot of cases, plugs those gaps for here's what it's like to actually do the work, as opposed to learning the theory in the classroom and pass that along. So I think there's a shout out to our post-secondary partners as well, in terms of the advancements that they are looking to make to provide those kinds of experiences. And of course, they need the cooperation and the partnership of the employer community to be able to do that as well. But I think many of them do that very well. Gotcha. Johnny?
Yeah, so I'm very pleased to see that Sandro is willing to step on the landmines for us. Well, as a regulatory body, we're looking for 2 main components when people apply to get licensed. Of course, is the fundamental academics, which are, as you heard from Sandro, the schools are doing a good job. There's an accreditation program that helps provide some harmonization or consistency across the nation. But as the regulator, we're also looking at the skill sets that are coming in from their experiential exposure. And as we've heard, it's varied. During these difficult times, that's something that we're now keeping an eye on. We're monitoring it. Traditionally, you need 48 months of post experience after your degree, or at least you get some credit for partial work during your schooling. But I would say that we haven't seen the manifestation yet. It's a little early. The young graduates I can speak to, I got a daughter that's trying to do schools virtually. I think the school programs are pivoting. She's not in engineering, but what I've noticed is that the students are pretty agile and pretty resilient. So although it's not really clearly in our mandate to look at the skill talents required of industry, I would only offer that if there are gaps that are identified, and I think OSPE does some of this research, I would hope that those in the industry align with those who can best provide the necessary professional development programs to bridge those gaps.
Cheryl, I did want to make a follow-up question here, because the part of the thing that you call experiential, the co-ops and the interns and so internships, I presume next to none of that has been able to happen over this past year while we've been in the midst of COVID-19. So I wonder how concerned you are that whoever is receiving the training to go into this field for a career going forward, are they missing out on something fairly significant here? And will that affect them going forward?
It has certainly been a challenge. Now, our hope is, of course, the majority of the graduates who are coming into our programs have 2 or 3 years within the college system, and that at some point before they're graduating through the course of this pandemic, they will be able to get back into that kind of experience. But again, our college partners, the educators, instructors, are concerned about the ability not to be able to provide those same opportunities right now during the shutdown. And yes, it will be a gap for that cohort.
Sandro, I wonder, I saw you nodding your head there, and I'm just wondering, should we be concerned that the engineers going forward are not going to be as well trained or have that kind of hands-on experience that those who might have been trained 5 and 10 years ago will have?
Oh, absolutely. We've been actually, one of the things that OSPE does is look at labor market as well, the engineering labor market right across Canada. And we're actually just embarking on a study to just recognize just how the pandemic has impacted engineering students and recent grads. We have anecdotal evidence, and we also have talked to Stats Canada, and they've demonstrated, or their initial stats, that it's impacted underrepresented groups more than it has your traditional engineering groups. So, your women, your engineers from your BIPOC populations have felt the brunt of it more than, your traditional male engineers have. So, we hope to have that research done by September and put some programs together on how to remedy that. But certainly that is a big component of it, because again, employers are looking for engineers and engineering graduates that can make an impact right away, not have to make 4 years of investments before they have that return on investment. And co-op and internships are certainly a big component of that.
You haven't got the final stuff altogether, obviously, because you mentioned it's going to be the fall before you have it. But you did say you're hearing some anecdotal evidence come forward already. What kind of stuff are you hearing?
Well, we have a diversity inclusion task force, and they've done some research, and we've also again worked with Stats Canada, the labor market division, and they've done some research. And we've heard, because now people are working from home, there are some stereotypes, I suppose. There's some latent barriers where, if I've got to lay off staff and realize people are going to have to work from home, I'm going to be more up to lay off my female staff, because they're probably going to have to deal with their family at home, with their kids at home, and that's going to impact the engineering that needs to get done. And that's not true. I mean, it's still some of the stereotypes that we're still combating in the profession, some of the barriers we're trying to remove.
Johnny, you got any anecdotal evidence you want to share with us?
There's, like I said, our statutory requirements, you need to bring your experience resume to the forefront. We haven't seen the impact yet. It's a little early, I would think, but we're prepared. Like, we deal with internationally trained applicants, and we do have an experience requirements committee that will, on a lot of these cases, interview these people. So I suspect that there could be a situation if we were to see an applicant that is unfortunately undergoing these difficult things that you're pointing to, and we can't wait to see what OSPE provides in terms of its research. We'll have to adjust, but we're comfortable that we have the mechanisms to be able to at least give each and every applicant a fair assessment in order to see whether or not they're qualified to get a license to practice professional engineering.
Okay. Just before I hit the three of you up with the next question, I guess I should just say parenthetically at this stage, I've noticed that a bunch of people weren't on this Zoom feed from 6 o'clock on the button on. We've had more people enter the Zoom chat during the course of this. So let me just repeat for those of you who may not have heard it off the top. We are going to do a bit of a Q&A here, myself and the three panelists, but then we will take your questions for our three panelists after a certain point. So if you go to the chat function at the bottom and you type in your question there, Beige will be taking a look at them and then passing them along to me. So you do have an opportunity to directly ask your question to our three panelists today. Just go to the chat function, type it in, and they will get to me, and we'll do that, I don't know, in 10, 15 minutes or something like that. Okay, next thing. You've all talked about the different skills that are required to be good in this profession, but you may not necessarily all agree on what the most undervalued skill is. So I want to get some sense of that right now. Sandro, why don't you go first this time? What's the most undervalued skill?
In my opinion, and again, from what I've heard from both employers and now what I'm hearing from engineering schools, is empathy. Again, it's a soft side. I hate using the word soft skills, but the empathy. Engineers need to be empathetic to the needs of society. So that would be the one thing. And I don't know how you train empathy. I don't know how you build that skill. But certainly, engineering schools are starting to look at a candidate's empathetic abilities when they're looking at who do we let into our school.
It's not just IQ, it's EQ.
Exactly.
Okay, can you give me for instance, I would love an example here of a situation where you think an engineer had an opportunity to be empathetic in a certain set of circumstances and didn't put the puck in the net. What does that look like?
It's because I stepped on the landmines earlier, right? You're asking me this again. Okay, hypothetically.
There you go.
Hypothetically, it's a situation where I talked about, I've got to lay off staff. Who am I going to lay off? I shouldn't, assume that, I should lay off my female staff because they have family duties at home that can impact their ability to do engineering for my company. That's I guess a traditional stereotype that is still prevalent in engineering. We host an EDI conference every year in November. And just last week for Black History Month, we had a Black engineering panel, and we still hear stories like this in 2021. So, understanding, how people interact and their family lifestyles, and, how you need to accommodate, I think is a great example of empathy.
Johnny, from your perch, what's an undervalued skill?
Sure, I would add in today's world, you got to be conscious, even though it sounds difficult to do, of your subconscious biases. I think a lot of that training needs to be put in. I know when I went to school, one of the thoughts when you were in engineering school is you're an elitist, and that really doesn't bode very well in today's world. It probably didn't bode well in my time, but it was a natural extension of the way when you went to school, the way you sort of conducted amongst your common peers in the classroom. And I think the subconscious bias issue would help even in the empathy side, simply because it'll help you reflect and perhaps make you a better human being, first of all. And if you're a better human being, my world says that you're also going to be a better whatever you are, including a professional.
Hear, hear. Cheryl?
I'm going to continue the theme of the soft skills, but I think mine is going to be around effective communication. And that I think has been exacerbated by the pandemic, because you no longer have sort of the in-person opportunity where you can get people up to speed. There has to be a more concerted effort. But I think a big part about engineering technology is about problem solving. So effective communication for us is just as much about listening effectively, because if you haven't heard the problem right, you're not going to come forward with the right solution. But then when you have a solution in place, you have to be able to sell it effectively. And I think in terms of a skill that can be undervalued compared to the technical skills, but it's a really important part of being able to be that full technician or technologist.
I don't know if I get a vote on this one, but since I'm moderating, why not? I would really like to underline that last one, Cheryl. I think that's a great one. And in particular, we've been very fortunate enough on the agenda to have some really skilled communicators from the engineering field come on and be guests on our program. And, that makes such a difference in terms of trying to get a message across to an audience that is not as familiar with this field as obviously all of you folks are. So I don't know what the three of you can do to re-emphasize the need to be able to speak to a general audience in plain terms, in plain English, but I think that would do an enormous amount for the image of the profession and obviously to get your message across. My 2 cents.
Totally agree.
I'll tell you, Steve, it's a tug of war with the schooling system. As you know, the course load, and you said you have a niece in Concordia, so hats off to her. It's a balancing act. The schools want to put in more of these soft skill programs, but they're also up against an accreditation situation where you've got to get all the hard technical courses done. So this is part of what I think OSPE or Sandro was speaking about. There's got to be mechanisms to augment what you don't get in your formal education. But from what I can tell from just a small sample of individuals I've had the pleasure of speaking to, and I'm talking about recent graduates, I find them to be quite good at their communication skills. They're also demonstrating, at least to the conversation I've had, with a lot of empathy. And one of the things they're really good at is the new technology, which I can tell you for myself, even just getting on Zoom calls initially was a bit of a stretch. As I said to everybody at high school, I was Johnny Z. Here I'm Johnny Zoom. I go to Zoom calls after Zoom calls. But so I think the communication piece and all these soft skills, they got to be balanced a little bit, because technology is, as we all know, is proliferating at an enormous rate. And for even an undergraduate degree to stay on top of that, I think you'll probably see from cohort to cohort significant changes as compared to when I went to school. And I don't want to date myself, but I think it's quite a different world that's out there.
Sandro, you wanted to add?
To your point, I'm going to highlight COVID as an example. There's so much information out there around COVID, how it's transmitted, how to protect yourself. And, you know, you hear some very learned medical professionals talking about it. And, you know, I don't want to put him on the spot, but Dr. David Williams, you know, I watch those press conferences almost, you know, every day. And they ask him, the reporters ask him questions. And for the life of me, I have no idea what he's saying, you know, when he's answering them. So, and I'm not an engineer as well. So, you know, I'll go to engineering conferences and I hear some people present, and same thing. I'm like, are they speaking English? And, you know, so it's really important that and this is maybe where the empathy comes in, understand your audience. Who are you talking to? And what's the message you want to get across? And how are you connecting with them? So I totally agree.
Cheryl, there's no question that an epidemiologist who can speak English as opposed to medicalese is a superstar right now. Do we need those for engineers as well?
Yep. And I think Sandro makes a really good point about the audience, particularly is it a technical audience or a non-technical audience, because that needs a completely different level of skill.
Do you think, Cheryl, that the pandemic has accelerated the rate of adaptation of technology?
Oh, absolutely. You know, nothing like being forced. What's the saying that necessity is the mother of invention? And we sure ended up with necessity about a year ago today to have this figured out. And I think I would say for our sector, you know, technology is in the name. So they probably have been along the lines of early adopters, and it perhaps hasn't been quite as extreme, but you're certainly finding a number of sectors, and ours included, where this kind of a presentation just wouldn't have been the norm. A year ago, we all would have been sitting behind a skirted table, each with our own microphones, pushing the button when it was our turn to speak. And that would have been the format that this event would have taken place in. You know, part of it, I think, is an advantage. We're reaching people we never would have reached in that format last year. So there's always good sides and bad sides to being pushed into this kind of acceleration. But I think the key will be to find out where we have achieved advantages, particularly in the ways we serve members, and make sure those stay beyond the pandemic and we don't just revert back to the way things were always done before.
I asked the question, Sandro, because I have heard it said by people in the post-secondary world that they managed to do basically in about 3 weekends what it otherwise would have taken 10 years to do, namely move tens of thousands of courses online for students to be able to take almost instantly. And I wonder if you have a similar analogous example from the world of engineering whereby, you know, the pandemic forced you to pivot, you were able to, and here's the result.
Well, I think the pandemic really has forced a lot of companies to rethink how they do things. You know, not only from an engineering side, but from an operations side. A number of organizations have, you know, shut their physical offices, not only temporarily, but permanently. You know, after doing it for 3 months, 6 months, they said, you know, we don't really need a workplace. We have everyone working remotely. We don't need them to come back in the office. And that has, you know, encouraged some companies to look for talent globally. You know, whether you're working in Toronto or Mississauga or BC or Maui, right? Wherever you are, if you have stable internet access and you're able to do engineering work and you have an ability to connect with other engineers to do that, great. And a great example is that Ford, you know, Ford Motor Company developed a new electric Mustang. They did that remotely. And, you know, think of all the engineering design, all the components that were needed to put that together, all the different engineering teams, they were able to all work on that remotely. So if you can design a car from scratch remotely, then I think you pretty much do most engineering work remotely.
Amazing. Johnny Zoom, what are you hearing?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that, I mean, I can't speak for businesses because I haven't got the firsthand spike on it, but on our own business, and we shut down, it's almost a year ago. It's March 17th is the date that's ingrained in my head. You know, all our staff had to leave the physical space. We had to quickly transition to a virtual environment. We had to scramble to get everybody laptops delivered to their homes, get everybody online. And we had to really adapt a lot of technology in a short span of time, as you said. And I think it's possible, but I think that was as exactly as Cheryl says, it's you need something that forces you to do it, and I guess you adjust. I just wanted to comment on the schooling side because you made reference to that. In discussions with the deans of Ontario, the schools, engineering deans of the schools in our province, it's opened up a new spectrum. You can now be taught by someone who's a Nobel Prize winner in whatever part of the world, and isn't that something for the next graduates who are able to take advantage of this? So I think we're going to see significant shift in both the pedagogical side, of course, and the issue you raised earlier in terms of, okay, so now how do we handle assessing someone's skill set or on the job skills when you're working in these potentially new virtual environments? And I think we're going to see some changes on all our ends, including the regulator, who by the very nature we're there. I mean, we're technically a barrier. We're an enabler because you got to get a license to practice professional engineering. But if you don't meet the standards of the requirements, you're not going to get through. And I think there's going to be significant shift even in our industry.
Well, that is a great and difficult and challenging issue. So let me follow up on that right now. Okay, Ms. Farrow, let me go to you first on this. If an employer doesn't have a commitment to lifelong learning, what's going to happen to those employees who get left behind by the technological changes, the changes in the workforce, et cetera, that are all happening right now?
Well, I think that's where a number of other stakeholders have to step in. Professional associations are a big part of them, because that's the kind of support that we need to be providing to our members. We go back to the very first question about continuous professional development, and making that a requirement helps our members to be able to adapt to that kind of environment. But I think our post-secondary education partners are a big part of it as well. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about today is the full-time curriculum, but we know that the colleges and universities deliver even more from a continuous learning perspective, and allows for that kind of reskilling and upskilling that allows people to adapt to those kinds of changes. And we know that government has a role as well, and that's the kind of thing that they're tracking at the 30,000 foot level, and at minimum making sure there's funding or programs available that either the individuals or the associations or the educational institutes can access, so that we can provide that kind of help. Now, that's not to say I don't think we should abscond the employers of that responsibility. And I think we need to keep reminding them of their important role in ensuring that their staff stays current. But I think with those three other stakeholders, we have a very strong security net for those kind of impacted employees.
Sandro, your view on that?
Yeah, so I think going back to your very first question about is mandatory continuous professional development a good thing? Yes, because if I'm an employer and I have 20 or 30 engineers, and now it's mandatory that they get trained, I'm going to ensure that they get trained on the technology and on the needs that are going to help my company grow. So I'm actually going to invest in that. Where when it's not mandatory, then it's like, hey, if you guys want to do some training, great, go do it yourself, and you're on on your own dime and on your own time. But now that as a way to keep my staff and encourage my staff to grow, I'm going to invest in them. What has happened in the past is that companies have actually poached other engineers from other companies. It's a lot easier, to get someone with 5 years experience and offer them an extra $10,000 a year, as opposed to, invest over 5 years in that young engineer. So, mandatory CPD is going to help with that, to ensure that, everyone gets the opportunities to get trained and upskilled. And, certainly our organizations, we're not going to take on the responsibility of training. Our job is really to enable companies to be able to do it. So we're looking at we've launched a number of opportunities and assistance to help them. We did webinars, we did an Eng Talk series, which is similar to like TED Talk, podcasts, etc. And governments do have a role, and this is where I'm going to, again, step on another landmine. I don't think governments are actually focusing on the right things. they're focusing on the needs of today, and they're not focusing on the needs of tomorrow. Certainly, they've put out a lot of money, and rightly so, to hire more and train more personal support workers and more skilled trades. But there aren't a lot of programs to help engineering and technology students and engineering grads and technology grads with upskilling. And the other thing I look at, we talked about being connected and the importance of having reliable connectivity with communities. Governments are focusing on broadband, so they had to make a decision: broadband versus 5G. And they've decided we're going with broadband. Well, that's great. Broadband is the technology of today. 5G is the technology of tomorrow. So, when I talk about, lifelong learning, I think some of the learning that our governments need to get into is maybe some technology literacy. They need to upskill their understanding of technology and rely on organizations like ours who, advocate to government and provide that engineering voice to say, here's where technology is going. It's going to cost you a lot less to actually invest in it now than it will down the road. And a really great story, it's not an analogy, a really great example is, when the PC government first came into power in 2018, one of the first things they did in the first few months is they ripped out all the EV charging stations on provincially owned sites, right? A year later, what are they doing? They're investing multi-millions of dollars of car companies to build electric vehicles. Now, what do they need to do next? Build more charging stations. So, understanding where technology is going is so vital to make the right investments. And we need to start focusing on how to grow our economy as we get out of this pandemic.
That comes under the category of that was then, this is now.
Yeah.
Well, in the midst of that answer, though, Sandro, you did say there is a hierarchy of different institutions in our society that are kind of responsible to make sure that engineers and technologists keep up with the emerging trends in their field and with their education and so on. And, Johnny, there may not be a simple answer to this, but ultimately, whose responsibility is it at the end of the day to make sure that this all goes according to Hoyle?
Well, to me, ultimately, maintaining competency is really the responsibility of the individual professional. But as the regulator, we've got the duty to ensure that it happens. So closing the loop on your first question, I think imposing mandatory CPD is absolutely a necessary step in providing, at least for our mandate, providing the public some attestation that a license holder is indeed maintaining their skills. As I stated earlier, it's not sufficient for one to just rely on what one learned at the onset when you got into the profession. You need to keep it up. But just looping back on that, and it's not something that a regulator looks at in terms of, whether your employer provides you with the opportunity for CPD. It's a catch-22, and I think I agree with the two speakers or my colleagues there that the government plays a big role. When you look at historically, when we were moving as an economy into the information age or information revolution, whichever you want to call it, a lot of people were displaced with automation and all that. And of course, we had a lot of players, a lot of employees who were left behind. And so there was that initial requirement for the government to step in. So I totally agree with Sandro. I think they need to understand and get on top of this because the opportunities are there. The situation that's the pandemic has created is also an opportunity for new technologies. And, I think Canadian engineers and engineering technology professionals are very skilled and ready to take on the opportunities if they were, at least there's some support there from the government side. And again, employers, I think for the most part, we're an employer. We want to invest in our people. We want them to have the skills in order to succeed, not only for the entity, but in general for their own self. Because again, as you said, there could be a multitude of reasons why someone is left behind and then is needing to look for other suitable employment. I guess it comes down to funding. Can you make the economic equation work where a company, instead of poaching people, as Sandro says, invests in their people? That's a tough question. I don't know what the answer is. I truly hope, obviously as an employee, I would hope that that your own entity looks at you as an important, vital part of the resources. But again, it's also an economic situation, which sometimes is outside the control.
Mm-hmm. I note that we have almost 200 participants on this Zoom call here, and the questions have been coming in. So I think what I better do now is get some of these questions from the audience to you folks. And Cheryl, here's the first one for you. This is from Andrew Monkman. Would health and safety become a discipline under the CET designation someday? Why don't we start with that?
Well, I think basically occupational health and safety is considered sort of one of those table stakes pieces where it applies to a number of different disciplines under which we certify. But I'm not at this time aware that our committees, et cetera, that look after it are looking at it as a standalone discipline. But
Okay.
it certainly remains an important piece.
And Sandro, I notice your hand is up, and Andrew actually says here, Sandro can go deeper on this as well. So please ask him too. So there we go. Okay.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, I'm not a professional engineer, but I am a Canadian registered safety professional. So the BCRSP is a certifying body for safety professionals, and you'll find safety professionals in all walks of life and from all backgrounds. So certainly there are CETs and CETTs who are safety professionals, as are P.Engs. So there are university and college programs that have this as a certifying body that looks at education. They look at experience in order to get your certificate, as well as there is a very comprehensive mandatory CPD program in order to maintain your certification. It's quite extensive. I'm just going through it now. I have to do one more course. The ethics course that's required is actually done. You need to do it every 5 years, but it's a minimum 36-hour course. So again.
How do you like your chances?
I don't know. It's been a while since I've actually sat down for a 36-hour course.
Okay, next question here is from Pat Duong, who says, with the focus being on lifelong learning, do you think that has to happen through formal webinar, coursework, classes, certificates, all of that? Who wants in on this one? Go ahead, Cheryl.
I'd like to jump in on that one, because it's actually one of the things we took into consideration when we developed our requirements for continuous professional development. And we provide credit in a number of different areas, not just for what I would call formal learning, whether it's in class or through webinars. We certainly consider that providing contribution in the community, volunteering, mentoring, writing papers, teaching are all ways that continuous professional development can be achieved. We also recognize it for volunteering in our own organizations. And again, we talked about soft skills earlier. I've heard from so many of the volunteers that I've spoken with in our organization about how much they've been able to develop their leadership skills simply through fulfilling a volunteer role in our organization. So we provide credit, so we recognize that as continuous professional development in terms of their mandatory requirement. But it's part of the philosophy that there are many ways to continue to enhance your professionalism and your learning and your skill.
We got a really nice controversial question here, and it's for Johnny Zoom. Here we go. This is from Lauren Cutler. The majority of engineering discipline cases involve ethical breaches from where individual engineers don't recognize their technical capabilities to companies such as SNC-Lavalin, which engaged in several international illegal activities, including breaking laws against the bribery of foreign officials. Where do you see the role of mandatory, regular, ethical training as part of CPD? Can a better job be done of training engineers on ethical practice beyond just PEO's Code of Ethics and Professional Misconduct?
Oh, that's a nice long-winded question. Well, yeah,
good and punchy too, though.
Yeah, that's okay. And I shout out to Lauren for that. So I think ethics is the core of most professionals, and it's one of the things that we pride ourselves with. We tell a lot of people, we point to it a lot and say, ethics is what separates a lot of our people from others. And so the issue that he's referring to there, I think from the SNC-Lavalin is a duty to report. It's an obligation under our Code of Ethics that if you see something that's not in keeping with the duty to the public welfare, it goes beyond your employee. You should raise it to the regulator. We get a lot of people who do call in, and then we kind of alert the impacted parties. Not sure I can do much more justice and say there's going to be a requirement in our current voluntary CPD program. There's a requirement for everyone who's licensed to do a code of ethics refresher every year. It's a ethics webinar or video that you go on and you watch and you participate through answering some of the questions. We think that's going to be a mainstream even when we go to mandatory CPD. In terms of additional courses, I'm not aware that we're looking into adding any more courses. For those that don't know, one of the requirements to getting your license is to write the professional practice exam, and it's a law and ethics exam. So at the front end, you do get tested in that area. Steve, I don't know what else I can say.
Well, I got bad news for Sandro because your name's on this one too. Lauren wants to hear from you on this as well.
Yeah, well, I bet. Okay, so I'm going to try to support but challenge Johnny and P.O. on this as well. So now there is because I've asked his predecessor, the previous CEO and registrar, this question from a different perspective to understand the difference between, can an engineer lose his license on a strictly unethical behavior? The answer I got, and unless things have changed over the last while, is no. If it's professional, if it moves over into professional misconduct, then yes, then there's a provision within the act for an engineer to lose his or her license or be disciplined under professional misconduct. But there are, unethical behavior that doesn't cross into professional misconduct. PO has very little control over. So I think the question is, how do you define ethics and how do you define professional misconduct and what is a line and how do you clearly define that? And that's a challenge for any profession.
Sure enough.
I just want to chime in. I think the regulation as written just says if it's solely a breach of code of ethics. And I think you raise a good point. It's one of the things we are going to be revisiting to beef up a bit more of the so-called professional. It's unfortunate that we have to call it professional misconduct, that's part of the role of the adjudication role of the regulator. But you could just think of it as the inverse in terms of putting it on a positive side is professional conduct. And I think we do have to review the code of ethics because, again, they're dated. The world has changed somewhat, but Sandro, it's just solely a breach of code of ethics. Like, for example, on the ethics, if you're a licensed engineer, you're supposed to have your license prominently displayed in your office. So what happens if you don't? That'd be professional misconduct. So again, I take what you say. It is part of some of the work we're looking at, and I think you'll see some changes in the near future for sure.
Cheryl, you want to arbitrate this dispute here?
I'm not getting in the middle of that one.
Okay,
and that's
fair enough.
Because the smartest one out of all of us.
Yeah,
well, I've got a few more questions here, so we'll see if we can get to all these within the time we have left. Whoops, hang on a sec. That just jumped up. Now, Nasli, forgive me if I'm saying your last name incorrectly. Nasli Kaya, how are you planning to enforce lifelong learning onto the companies? Don't they have a significant role in investing in their employees? Okay, Cheryl, you get that one.
I get that one. We are working right now actually on an outreach program to the employer community. It's called our 360 Partnership Program, as well as personal outreach on my part as the CEO. So yes, a big part of it is communicating that message, the whole value in investing in employees. Actually, when Sandro was talking earlier about this issue of poaching, and I heard the best line in one of the previous organizations that I worked with employers complaining, if I'll just train them and they'll leave. And the answer is, well, what if you don't train them and they stay? So I think that's the message that we need to put forward. I think from our perspective, though, once again, in terms of supporting our members, we are not necessarily, as OACETT, going to be able to change the mind of every employer. But what we can do is make sure that we've got accessible CPD programs available for our members at low or no cost as part of their membership, so that they still have a way of fulfilling those requirements. They can access the requirements that they need to maintain their certification, even if they don't, for some reason, have the support of their employer. We do survey our members regularly to find out, what percentage of them get support from their employers, either for their membership dues or for CPD. And the percentage is fairly high, but it's certainly not universal. So we have to make sure we've got ways to support those who don't receive that from their employers.
Okay. Johnny Zoom, you get the next question here. This is from Gregory Kuzu, I guess is how he pronounces it. As a lifelong learner, can we make mandatory employers hire lifelong learners?
Huh. Can we make mandatory? Want to repeat that? Mandatory?
Sure. Can we make mandatory employers hiring lifelong learners?
Huh. Well, you might stump me on this one. I don't know if we can mandate that you have to hire lifelong learners. I think the best we're going to be able to do is, of course, impose the requirements for license holders to maintain their competence and to attest to it in a public forum through one of our registers. I would share that going in future state, and again, I have to speak in future state because this is something still in the infancy. I think you're going to see a shift to entity regulation more so. And so when we talk about entities, because as you know, we do offer certificate of authorizations for those who want to engage in providing engineering services to the public, they can only do so under the certificate of authorization. So that entity technically is governed and regulated through Professional Engineers Ontario. So there might be an opening there for that, where you're now looking at the entity and saying, all right, well, the entity is a component, is a totality of everybody that they have within their employment. So there may be something there in the future, but right at this stage, we don't.
Okay, Sandro, here's one for you. This is from Tony Pasteras, who writes, everyone spoke about the need to create more of the softer skills for engineering students. Are our current educators in our engineering schools equipped to deliver these softer skills? What more can we do to ensure this skill is effectively delivered? Do we need to have more resident engineers in our universities with the needed industry experience?
Yes. So it's a very good question. Certainly, having connections to industry are so vitally important. I look at it two ways. It's recruitment and training of engineering students. First off, let's recruit a more diverse student. Let's recruit a more rounded student. So, one of the things I proposed to one of the deans after a few beers was, let's say your minimum requirement to get in your program is 85%. So, use that as a first cutoff to get your pool of potential students. Your second thing is now, okay, great, they've met that educational requirement. What other things have they done? Where have they volunteered? How have they reached out to the community? That's one way to assess. I talked about empathy, but it looks at, are they lifelong learners? Are they multidimensional? And to be a good engineer, I talked about how important it is to be empathetic and multidimensional. So that is certainly one thing to look at. And the connections to industry are so vitally important because those connections will provide work integrated learning programs for students and co-op opportunities to further develop the student while they're in school. So yeah.
Cheryl, next one coming at you here. This is from Anis Ahmed Mandra. Do you think more needs to be done in terms for advocacy into more universities offering bridging programs between college technical diploma holders to Bachelor of Technology for continuing learning and career advancement later in career life?
I would say that is happening already within the institutions. We already are seeing what I'm going to call some blurring, where colleges and universities are integrating and they're building a stronger recognition of advanced credits. I think from our perspective, there is a continuity to the engineering community, and it goes from technicians and technologists through to the professional engineers. And I think every individual should have the opportunity to do what they can with the experience they already have and take it to the level that's most appropriate for their interests and their career goals. So, but to the point that needs to be advocated, I'm almost not sure that we need to make the case, because I think the institutions in many cases are there already.
Gotcha. Sandro, here's one from Usha Vivegananthan. Hope I'm saying that name correctly. You mentioned companies need to invest in their employees to encourage lifelong learning. How can government incentivize companies to invest in that? How can colleges and universities better cater to the needs of companies/working professionals?
Okay, so first off, I think one of the reasons companies aren't investing in lifelong learning is capital, available capital. And I'm not saying governments, one thing that they can certainly do is provide, tax credits for education for their employees. So if I'm investing in upskilling my employees, certainly that should be taken into consideration. But I think the easiest thing governments can do right now, especially with all these billions of dollars being invested in infrastructure, is move to a qualifications-based selection process. So right now, the way it works is a lowest cost, bid gets the contract. Well, that encourages companies to underbid and compete against each other to get that project and get the lowest bid. Well, I have engineering employers and principals telling me, my engineering costs or my, what I bid on these projects hasn't gone up, but all my costs have gone up. My liability insurance has gone up. My material costs have gone up. The engineers are expecting to get paid more than they were 5 years ago. And what I bill out is the same or even less than I did 5 years ago. Something's got to give. So moving to a qualifications-based selection process will allow companies who have the best solution to come to the top. And looking at the engineering cost of a project may increase the project cost overall by 0.5%, but it will improve the life cycle cost of that project 10-20%. And looking at the latest report that was done with I believe Global News and a few others with the water issues in northern indigenous communities and all the contracts that have gone belly up there, they're all awarded on lowest cost. So there's a business case to be made for better service moving to a qualifications-based selection process, and OSPE is certainly advocating for that.
Do you have any evidence or indication that the province is considering this?
They're listening, but they haven't made a decision. There have been some pilot projects, and the federal government is done some pilot projects as well. The pilot projects have also shown success. So we're hoping that the government may, move forward on this quicker rather than later.
Okay. Johnny, next one coming at you. And again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing the name. Claude Lag or Legui, not sure how he says it.
Logue.
Say again?
Claude Logue.
Logue. Okay, there we go.
Français.
Through governments, society is subsidizing the cost of education for kindergarten to PhD learners. Should CPD benefit from structured public funding as well? Johnny.
It's an interesting thought. I think if we're going to look at it globally and holistically as a nation, we might want to really consider that. Again, continuing professional development in companies or individuals, it amounts to obviously having funding, whether you pay for it or your company pays for it. As an individual, I need to stay on top of things. If my employer can't afford to pay for it, can I afford to do it? So I think that's a nice innovative thought. I'm going to take that one. That's worth looking at. Perhaps my counters over there, or at least Sandro, when he's hobnobbing with all the people down in Queen's Park, can start seeing whether or not there's some money to be put aside for that, because I think it would make for a nice project. You want your whole nation, the higher learners you have in your employee, the better the whole nation will be.
I'm not sure how much hobnobbing is going on at Queen's Park these days, given COVID protocols, but I take your point.
He's virtually there.
Virtually?
He's virtually there.
He's virtually hobnobbing. Okay. Cheryl, you got a view on this? CPD benefiting from structured public funding as well?
I think if we're going to embrace the concept of lifelong learning, then yes, why would it stop at schools? I think Sandro mentioned earlier the potential of something like a tax credit being a mechanism that could be used to fund something like that. Past governments have brought in those kinds of programs. I think the piece we'd have to be careful of there is, I know the programs I've dealt with in the past, you needed more resources to be able to apply for the funding than it was worth that you get out at the other end. So it would be perhaps a red tape consideration, but that might be a possible mechanism that's worthy. I think, again, if we're going to embrace it, we should embrace a way for it to be supported.
Okay, Sandro, coming back at you here. No name associated with this one, but here's the question. Can you shed some light as to what the other provinces and territories are doing with respect to lifelong learning? Are there any best practices you are seeing elsewhere in Canada from an engineering regulator and or engineering association that can be adopted in Ontario regarding lifelong learning?
Oh, this might be an answer or a question best answered by Johnny, because other regulators across the country have implemented a CPD program. Cheryl actually identified great components that need to be in CPD programs. Again, myself as a CRSP, I can talk to that, and they allow you to get learning opportunities through a various number of means, whether it's, again, as Cheryl mentioned, through mentoring, through volunteering, technical courses, non-technical courses, self-directed learning. So you actually need, I think, many opportunities and different exposures to CPD to get that full roundness of training and full roundness of learning. Not all of it can be done online. Not all of it can be done in classroom. I think the variety of training opportunities and variety of exposures provides a well-rounded learner.
Johnny, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, sure. So some of our sister associations, and when I mean that, I mean regulatory, provincial regulators in engineering, they don't have the benefit of Ontario, where we have OSPE as the member service group, and PO, strictly speaking, to some extent, is the primary job is to regulate the practice. So they have more of an association advantage than we do. But what I can say is that the research and the consultation that took place when PO was developing its current voluntary program indicated that for the most part, the people didn't want an emulation where you have all these variety of extra credit courses. They wanted the focus of our program is more of a risk-based. The individual engineer does an assessment based on where they work in terms of what they need to do to keep current in their work. And with that in mind, we are likely not going to be imposing specific courses. I think, as you've heard from my colleagues, you can get professional development in different areas. And so I think the courses will come out of other institutions. We won't be imposing it as a requirement. But best practices around the nation so far is there seems to be opportunities, as you heard from Cheryl. The programs are similar. You get credit for attending courses, of course. You get credit for webinars. I think with this current situation, you're probably going to get a lot of credit because there's a lot of stuff going on virtually. I don't know what the end state is going to be for PO's mandatory CPD program, but one thing was clear, as I said, from the research, that we won't be imposing specific courses on individuals. They'll be the masters of their own sort of domain, because as the uniqueness of engineering, engineers work in so many different areas that PO couldn't even start to be able to put programs together for specific individuals.
Okay, I'm just mindful of the clock here, so I think we got time for one more question. And Cheryl, I'll put this to you. This is from George Chaparou. Is that how he says his name? Lifelong learning has an affinity towards part-time studies while individuals have full-time careers. Mm-hmm. To personally upscale, I've been prescribed courses from OACETT and PEO that were not available at post-secondary institutions. In my case, I've transitioned from engineering to business because of program availability. Have you noticed this scenario as being common for lifelong learners?
Okay, there's a little more complicated one. I might get you to read that one more time as well, please, Steve.
Sure. I think George is looking into the notion that he has changed careers from engineering to business because of program availability. And he wonders whether you have noticed this scenario as being common for lifelong learners, that as they enjoy upskilling and staying on top of things, that they actually transition to other things.
Well, again, anecdotally, I can speak to our membership where we know that many of our members transition across disciplines. And it's one of the advantages, I guess, of the fact that our certification is for a certified engineering technologist or a certified technician. And it's not in any one discipline. So there is the ability for them to transfer so many of those skills from one area to another. I certainly know myself, I'm not in the same field I was that I came out of university in, and I think many of us can say the same thing these days. And it's perhaps one of the reasons as well, and I had a note of this, that CPD has become so much more important because people don't have lifelong careers any longer. You had a generation ago where people would go into one company and stay there for 35 or 40 years. That's not the same type of career trajectory we're seeing for individuals any longer. And it's one of the reasons why lifelong learning is so important, because it's become about marketing the individual and the package of skills that you bring, as opposed to getting into one location and then they would bring you the skills that you needed to continue to advance in that one organization.
Gotcha.
Steve, I was just going to add that I think it's a difficult issue, difficult question to put your head around it, but it's a supply and demand issue for one thing. But also when you look at the engineering and engineering technology professional arena, they're leading edge. So when you're leading edge, the supply is going to be small, the demand might be even smaller. And so the costs are sometimes a lot more, and the investment in time. So I don't know whether or not we're ever going to get to that super state where people would say, wow, it's so economical for me to stick around and pick up more skill sets in this area. It's when you're in the leading edge, it's very difficult because who teaches the teachers, right? So you're in that situation.
Okay, let me ask everybody just to stand by, because we're going to do two more things before we sign off. The first thing is I need to give a shout out to somebody who's on, I don't know how much you folks on the Zoom feed here, flick the arrows back and forth to see who else is on with you. But I did earlier at the beginning of this, and I noticed that somebody that I work with is on here. So a shout out to Sandro Jonas, who's one of our fine producers at the Agenda, and who I guess by marriage is affiliated with the engineering field. So hello, Gio. And I was going to say I'll see you at work tomorrow, but of course I won't, because you guys aren't allowed in the building yet. Only I am. And the other thing is, can I get Sarah Bradshaw to come in here, because she is going to put a survey question up for everybody who is partaking here and needs a minute of your time to help fill out the survey. There it is right there. And Sandra, you want me to read through this thing? I guess, it's pretty self-explanatory. This is a NEM poll. We want to know what you think. Click all of the issues here that apply for you. I learned new or deepened existing knowledge, skills, or values. Learning from this event will be helpful to me or my community or my organization. I would attend another online NEM Ontario event. That one's trending at 93%. That's very encouraging, I'm sure, to the organizers. The Zoom format of this event was professional. I'd like to see that number go up a little bit. It's certainly a lack of affection of the moderator I interpret that of right now.
Absolutely.
And the panel discussion format of the event was engaging. These are pretty good numbers, folks. These are pretty good numbers. Okay, we'll leave that up there for another, let's leave that up for another 30 seconds. We've got about 70% of the people who voted already, so we'll leave it up for just a few more seconds and let everybody who's on the call vote. We've got about 3/4 of you voting right now, and we'll just leave it up for another few seconds so that everybody has a chance to weigh in on this. And while people are voting, and we've got only about 19% more people to vote, I know everybody who partook in this Zoom feed would like to join me in thanking Johnny Zoom and Sandro Perruzza and Cheryl Farrow for a really fascinating and engaging discussion. The marks that are coming up here certainly indicate that everybody who partook in this really got something out of it. So that's a really good sign. Can we also say that if people want more information on all of what's been going on, all of what is going on during NEM, nemontario.ca is the website to go to, and there's tons of information there about all the activities that are taking place. And there's the results. Can everybody see these on their screen?
Yep.
I don't know. You all can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, the highest number in terms of votes, which has got to be very encouraging for the people who organized this, was I would attend another online NEM Ontario event, 90% approval. That's pretty good. Where I come from, that's a good number. In any event, Cheryl, Sandro, Johnny, thanks so much for this. And that brings to a close our presentation here. Thanks everybody for joining us, and until next time.